She's carrying a domestic implement. This is one of the places where we get the modern image of the witch riding a broomstick through the air. So witches are thought to ride on these long poles through the air as if they were some kind of chariot or some kind of animal. Hello, I'm Professor Marion Gibson and welcome to Talk 2 in our little short course about witchcraft in history. If you missed episode 1, I talked about what a witch was, the definition of witchcraft. In lecture 2 today, I'm going to talk about demonology, the big theory behind what witches were, and the theory that drove witch trials in the 15th to 18th centuries right across Europe and North America. What is demonology? It's a long word, but you can see it's got the word demon in it, and that is at the heart of what this theological theory is. It's a theory about what demons are and what they do in the world, who the devil is, and by extension, it's also a theory about witches. Really, the first demonologists come along in the 15th century, and demonology kicks off in the Alpine region, southern Germany, northern Italy, the French Alps. People are starting to think a lot about witches and demons in those areas in the mid-15th century. The first demonologists in the 1530s were theologians. They were inquisitors as part of the Catholic Church's legislative and judicial structure. And they were tasked with finding heretics. So they would go into communities and find anybody there who didn't appear to be following proper Catholic doctrine. And they would put them on trial. Quite often there would be quite a merciful outcome. Really what they wanted these people to do was conform. They didn't particularly want to execute them. But often, of course, if people refused to conform, then there would be executions as a result of this. What we're looking at here is the birth of Protestantism, really, people protesting against the Catholic Church and wanting to have their own doctrine and beliefs. And as part of that hunt for heretics, inquisitors often find people who believe in witchcraft, who perhaps say that they are witches, or who want to accuse other people of being witches. And gradually the images come together. So there is the image of the heretic, who is a misbeliever, but then there's also the growing image of the witch, who is a Satan worshipper, who is somebody who's made a pact with the devil, who sold their soul to Satan, who perhaps as a result of this been given powers to harm their neighbours. And so when witchcraft accusations come forward, people believe, my child has been hurt by a witch, or my farm has been damaged by a witch. They would quite often end up in an inquisitorial court in front of somebody who was used to questioning and looking for heretics. And out of that big theological conflict comes this theory of witchcraft. And it gets more and more elaborate over the course of the 15th century. By the later 15th century, so about 1485, something like that, there is a pretty firm notion that what witches are is demon-worshipping heretics, and that what inquisitors ought to be doing is holding a great number of witch trials to weed these people out of communities across Central Europe. One of the most important inquisitors of this time is a man called Heinrich Kramer, and he writes a book called Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches, if you translate it from the Latin. And his book is very influential. It's not perhaps the most influential demonology ever written across the whole course of this period, but it's certainly one of the most famous ones. And Heinrich is particularly misogynistic, which I think is a really interesting development in demonology. So it's not enough really to say that there are a number of people across the world who are worshipping the devil and who are witches and who need to be weeded out of communities. Heinrich starts to turn the focus specifically on women. And he says things like women are intellectually like children. He says when a woman thinks alone, she thinks evil. He quotes all of these classical sources, really anybody who's ever said anything misogynistic. And he piles it all into demonological theory. So by the end of the 15th century, a lot of people are looking for witches who are specifically female, and they're hunting them down as heretics. The image of the witch is a bit different to the one that we looked at in the first talk. So we're not really thinking about ordinary village women in quite the same way. We're thinking about a huge cosmic threat. And in this talk, I want to think about what the witch looks like to a demonologist. Let's look at a demonological image of witches. You'll see if you've watched the first lecture that this is something rather different. When we looked at the ordinary woodcut images of witches, they were just regular women. They were clothed to start with, which is perhaps the most important difference. And I think you can see here the concern that demonologists have with women's bodies. Here we have specifically naked women displaying themselves to the viewer in ways which people at the time would have considered immodest, almost pornographic. You can see also that the witches are clustered around something, and that something appears to be a kind of pot, perhaps with some strange markings on it. And out of that pot is coming some sort of magical force. So we've got something pouring out of the pot in the middle of the image, and that draws the eye upwards. And then at the top of the image, we can actually see a woman flying through the air. And when we look a little closer, we can see that she's on the back of a goat. So there are animals again in these images, just as there were in the woodcuts that we looked at in the first talk. But it's very different. Here is a goat flying through the air. So we're not looking at little toads and cats kind of playing around the feet of the ordinary female witches. What we're looking at is a female witch riding on the back of a goat through the sky. And she's holding something that looks like a pitchfork. And in that pitchfork is a pot. So clearly there's something else going on here, magical. And that pot joins the pot at the bottom of the image in doing some sort of horrible magical work. You can see there are some other animal images in the picture too. And behind the seated witch on the right, as you look at the image, you can see there's a cat with its back to the woman. And on the other side, you can see some skulls. One of them may be a human skull, but the other looks like maybe a horse skull or something like that. And then there's this whole clutter of magical paraphernalia around the bottom of the image. Finally, the witches appear to be out in a wood. There's a very prominent tree at the right-hand side of the picture. So we may be thinking about people who are meeting a long way away from their community out in the wild woods. So how does this sum up the image that demonologists had of witches then? Well, it does a number of bits of work. It tells us that the image of the witch is quite sexualised. It's quite misogynistic in the minds of demonologists. This is surely in part because the inquisitors who formed the backbone of the demonological movement were brought up in all-male communities, so they had very little knowledge of women. If they're an inquisitor, they are probably going to be a Dominican monk, and that means that they live a celibate lifestyle in an all-male community. And they don't really have a lot of experience of what women do, what women think about, what women's bodies look like, the kind of things that might happen in a woman's life. They don't really know women. So they think of them as being, I think, very strange and troubling creatures. And when you look at the image and you see that tree on the right-hand side, maybe one of the things you start to think about is Eve and the Garden of Eden. And I think that was something that very much haunted the minds of demonologists in the medieval period through the 16th and 17th centuries. They were thinking that Eve was the gateway to all evil. What did Eve do? Well, she and Adam lived in the Garden of Eden at the dawn of human history. They were the first people. And Eve was tempted by the devil, just like witches would be centuries later, so the demonologists must have thought. She eats an apple from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and she offers that apple to Adam as well. And God has specifically prohibited them from eating that fruit. So when they do, it means that they themselves are in danger of damnation, and so are all of their descendants, you and me and everybody. So Eve is seen as a very, very problematic figure in the Christian mythology that is the foundation of the Christian church in the medieval and early modern period. That tree looks awfully like the tree in the Garden of Eden. And so maybe we think about these naked women, and Eve is often portrayed naked in art of this period, as all being Eve's descendants, Eve's daughters. I think that's one of the things that is going on in this image and in the image that demonologists have of women. What else can we see here? Well, when we think about the pots, maybe we think about cauldrons. You know, if you've ever seen a production of Macbeth or thought at all about Shakespeare's witches, you'll know that a cauldron is really important, to the extent that that scene in the play is referred to as the cauldron scene. What are they doing in the cauldron? Well, they're mixing up all sorts of nasty things. Bits of human bodies, bits of animal bodies, strange potions, poisons, bits of herbs, all sorts of things that shouldn't belong together. So that image of a pot seems to suggest an image of ingredients being mixed together chaotically and something pouring out of it, which doesn't look like good news for humanity. We've got these clouds of something or other flying off, probably to do harm in the community somewhere. One of the things demonologists had to think about was, how does magic work? And we'll come back to that in a minute. What you can also see in the image of the flying goat is an image of Satan. So we talked in the first talk about how some witches, particularly in England, were thought to have demonic animals that kind of embodied their pact with the devil. Well, here is another of them, but this is much more likely to be Satan himself. He's often imaged as a goat in paintings and woodcuts and other kinds of imagery from this period that people would have seen in churches and they would have seen in books and newspapers and pamphlets. So I think we're probably looking at Satan here, and the witch is riding on the back of Satan through the air. How is she doing it? Well, it's very odd, isn't it? She's doing it backwards, so she's riding backwards. Imagine the way you would ride a horse. This woman is riding a goat backwards. There's something about inversion going on here, I think. And the way that witches do things is often seen to be backwards, counterintuitive, counterproductive, evil, reversing all that is good in society. And she's carrying a domestic implement. This is one of the places where we get the modern image of the witch riding a broomstick through the air. So witches are thought to ride on these long poles through the air as if they were some kind of chariot or some kind of animal. And where are they going? Well, they're going to a witch's sabbath, which is exactly what we see in this image here. The witches get together to do evil for the community. So this is the kind of image that demonologists would have had in their head when they thought about witches. Why do demonologists think these things then? They seem to us almost funny, something out of a Monty Python sketch or the show Witchfinders. You know, this is surely comic. People can't really believe this stuff, much less, surely, can they execute other people for doing this kind of thing. But of course, that's the point of the witch trials. That's exactly what they do across the 15th to 18th centuries. And we think that tens of thousands of people fell victim to this demonology. It feels like a conspiracy theory too. I think there are images in modern society of people doing these kind of things, and there are ideas that there may be groups of people who are working against society secretly, conspiratorially. So we sort of recognise that mindset, I think. But you look back and you think, some of the most intelligent people of their time believed in this theory. Not only believed in it, but actually promoted it. We've got clergymen, we've got inquisitors, we've got church personnel of all kinds, if you like. We've got magistrates. I talked in the first talk about how King James, an actual king, also became a demonologist. He wrote a book in the 1590s, literally called Demonology, in which he put forward ideas about what witches did and how the devil intervened in the world and why it was something that people ought to be doing more about. That something being hold witch trials. So some of the most intelligent, highly educated, and often really the most ethically aware people in their society believed in this conspiracy theory, demonology. Why did they do that? I think one of the takeaways from this, I hope that you'll take away from it, is they weren't stupid. They believed in these things because they had a mindset which predisposed them to do so. And that was that God owned the entire world, the entire universe, and therefore everything that they did was framed by religion. It was the most important thing to them in many ways. And they had developed this binary understanding within that religion that God was in charge of everything and he was good and benevolent. But he had an opponent, an antagonist, and that person, Satan, represented all that was evil. So therefore, logically, really, when you look at it, if you imagine that God has his good people in churchmen and congregations across Europe and North America, so also the devil must have his wicked people And they must be witches. They must be working against the good people. It starts to make sense when you look at it like that. And if you think that those people are active in your society, isn't it your duty to do something about them? Shouldn't you actually go out and hunt them and punish them and make sure that they don't hurt you and your neighbours, and they don't damage God's world, and they don't attack God, and they don't disrespect God? Isn't it your job, in many cases, particularly if you're an inquisitor, to do exactly that? You can start to see why it makes sense to them. And so, across the 15th to 18th centuries, there is a slew of demonological books, hundreds and hundreds of them, and hundreds of pamphlets, newspaper accounts, saying to people over and over again, there are witches. You must do something about the witches. If you think somebody in your community is a witch, it is your duty to report them to the magistrate or to the clergyman, whatever legal setup there is in the area where you live, and to do something about it. Demonology is an incredibly powerful ideology, and when you put it together with the folk beliefs about witchcraft that I talked about in the first talk, I think you can see why there are so many witch trials across the 15th to 18th centuries in Europe and North America. Next time, join me to talk about what happens at a witch trial. We'll look at the individual stories of accused men and women and see what happened to them. I hope you've enjoyed today's talk. Please check out the link below for lots of additional resources where you can learn more about the topic of today's talk and the wider history of witchcraft.